Hello and welcome to the next video in the Wized beginner series. In this video, we're going to look at how to use apps and requests inside of Wized to connect to external applications and API endpoints. In the last tutorial, we built a very simple button tracker that would track how many times we clicked a button. We had a tour through the Wized UI, and we looked at how we set up a variable to track the button clicks, a text element that shows the number of clicks, and the button that increments the click each time the user clicks the button. In this tutorial, we're going to create a very simple AI story generator. We're going to use an AI tool called Groq, which is similar to ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, so on and so forth. The reason I'm using this is the API is free to use. I want people to be able to do this tutorial without having to pay for an AI tool that they don't have, and that allows us to do so. Okay, a quick look at some terminology. What is an API request? You're going to be using these a lot when building web applications. API stands for Application Programming Interface, and it's a way for different software systems or applications to communicate with each other. Take ChatGPT as an example. Many online tools and software applications have a user interface that members of the public can just sign up to and start using. They will also often have an API. And that means that developers can integrate the application into their own software. And that's what makes them very powerful. They're standardized using rules. So you'll often hear the term REST API, R-E-S-T. That's a particular type of API. It's what Wized uses. And that just means that these API calls are standardized in a particular way so that developers know how they're going to work once they see that they're REST APIs. Then the information that we need to use the API is going to be in something called curl. That stands for client URL. And that allows us to write HTTP requests. This is just a way of making requests from one piece of software to another. Lastly, those API requests are going to have a HTTP request type that we have to select inside of Wized. We don't need to worry too much about these. We just need to know that the type corresponds to a verb. It means the API is going to take a particular action. Get is for fetching data. Post is for sending it. Put is for updating existing information. Delete is to delete it. And patch is to partially update existing information. Again, we don't need to go into the technicalities of these. We just need to recognize what they are so that we can use them inside of Wized. So let's look at some API documentation. This is the developer website for Webflow, and they have a list of APIs that we can use. And we're going to see those over here on the left. They have API endpoints for listing your sites, listing your pages, managing the CMS, and managing forms. So if we go into one of these, let's say we want to create live collection items in our CMS. Over here, we're going to see the information that we need. Up in the top right, we can choose the language. You'll typically see Python and TypeScript or JavaScript in here for if you're writing your own application. What we want is the curl, and we need to enter all of this information into Wized to use this correctly. At the top, we have the URL. So all API endpoints have a URL. If we click it and paste it, we can see the full URL up here. And it'll also tell us here what HTTP request type it's using. In this case, it's post because we are creating new information. If we're getting back a list of live collection items, you'll see that this changes to a GET request. And there's also a lot less information needed. And then on the left here, it's going to give us information about the parameters or the different info that we can pass to the API endpoint. Next, we're going to go over to Groq. So if you go to groq.com, groq.com. You can create an account, and that's going to take you to their cloud console. On the left, we can go to documentation and into API reference. And they have a couple of different endpoints. So each API link or URL is called an endpoint. We want the one for creating a chat. So again, compared to Webflow, all of these documentation sites are going to look a little different, but they're going to ultimately give you the same information. Everything we need is here and here. This is a post request. So what we need to do is go over to Webflow and start setting up our app and our request. So in the last video, we looked at events, elements, and the data store. Now we're going to look at requests and apps, or my apps. So every request that you create first has to have an app. The app represents the service that you're using. So I don't have any at the minute. I'm going to click either the plus here or add app. And I'm going to give it a name, Groq, and I need to select an app type. What we have in here are REST APIs, and then we have 4 other options that are integrations that are built in directly to Wized. We have Airtable, Firebase, MemberStack, and Supabase. So these are back-end services where we can store information, we can have members, users can log in, that we have built integrations for directly in Wized. For everything else, AI, sending emails, sending texts, fetching stock data, whatever your app needs to do, we want to select REST or REST API. And that is going to ask us for a base URL. So the base URL is the first part of the URL that all the requests are going to use. This is going to be different for each application or each API that you're using. But we can see that this starts off with api.groq.com, OpenAI v1 chat. If we go to audio, it's v1 audio. And if we go to models, it's v1 model. So what we want to do is make this part the base. And then if we wanted to use all of these, we would have a request for chat, a request for audio, and a request for models. So let's copy that and go over to our base URL. We're going to get our function editor. In previous videos, or if you've been using Wized yourself recently, you might have noticed that in the past, when you first opened the function editor, there was nothing in here. Because return is almost always typed at some point, this now starts off with that already there, in case you're wondering why that has started appearing. So we want to enter this as a text string inside of 2 quote marks, and we want to paste it in like so. And because these are going to be combined, we need to either leave the slash off here and add it in the request, or do it the other way around. I'm going to put it in the request. You'll see what I mean in a minute. So that will do. We want to exit out of that, and that's our app. The apps are straightforward. We then want to go to requests and either click the plus up here or down here. That's going to open up the right side panel, and because in backend services like Airtable, Supabase, Xano, requests are usually typed lowercase, so we're going to do the same thing here with underscores. Groq create story. I'm not going to put it in a folder for now, and I have to link it to an existing app, like so. Okay, now we have some more options. We have method, URL endpoint, and credentials. Credentials is more advanced. We won't go into that. It is almost always just left at same origin. You typically won't have to change that. So on the documentation for chat, this is a post API request. We're sending information. So we want to change that to post, like so. For the URL endpoint, this is where we start to use our base application. So recall that we created that right up to here. So what we need is this part. And if we were using the audio API, we would make a new request for that. So I want to copy this, and I want to go into URL endpoint, which will open up the function editor, and I want to return that inside of quotes. Because it gets combined with the base URL, the final submission that the request is going to make is its URL endpoint, and then it's going to add on the rest of that base URL. Okay, close out of that. We now need URL parameters, headers, and body, or we have the option for those at least. URL parameters are where you add information to the end of the actual URL. So it might look like account, account equals, and then some text as an example. These are usually used when using a GET request, and the information is usually added in here in the actual URL. In this case, we don't need those, so we can skip past the URL parameters. What we do need are the header and the body. Headers provide metadata about the request and typically don't change during each request. The body provides the actual data used to process the request and tends to be different for each request. In this case, the content type and authorization stay the same, but the message that's being sent is usually going to change from request to request. In curl, the header, each item for the header is represented by a capital H, and for the body, it's represented by a lowercase d. So we need two headers. Content type, again, we don't need to get into it. It tells the API the format that you're sending over this request in. So you basically just copy whatever that is. I'm going to copy this part, application/JSON, because in headers, for the key, it's going to give us a pre-populated list. So in programming, we call these key value pairs. Content type is the key, the value is application/JSON. So for the header key, we want to select content type, and for the value, we want to return application/JSON. That's just a particular way of sending or formatting information to send it to an API endpoint. Next up, we have authorization bearer. This is very common. You'll be doing this on most requests that you make in Wized, and this is where you authenticate who you are. On the client side of an application, let's take ChatGPT again, you have user authorization. You sign in with an email and a password. For developers, when using API endpoints, these are usually done as API keys. And the $sign here tells us that we don't actually put this in, we replace this with our Groq API key. So if you go to API keys, you can create a new one. And you need to treat this like a password, like a secret. If someone else were to get this, they can make requests to this API using your API key. So we're using this for free, but if you had to pay for usage and someone found your API key, they can start using the usage that you've paid for. So these are secret, they need to be kept private. Because of that, many tools that you're going to use will let you create a key, a secret API key, and they then won't show it to you. That's how serious they are about the security of these. I can't see what that key was in the software, so that if someone does hack into my account, they can't get my API key. It's up to you to store that safely somewhere. We can see the name, we can edit the name, and we can delete it. So what you'll do is you will create one and copy the value, and I'd recommend storing it somewhere safely, offline or on your computer. Over in Wized, you're going to go to the data store. And down here is an option called secrets. And you can create a new one, give it a name, and enter the value. And there'll be a save icon once you edit that. Then whenever you go back into it, I've called mine Groq_API_key. Here you can view it again. So you can use this to hide it and to view it later on if needed. Why is this important? Other than the secrets, everything in your Wiz project is viewable to a tech-savvy user, anyone that knows something about computers and applications. They'll be able to see the code that you create in Wized. The reason for that is Wized uses client-side JavaScript. So when I build this project and when I publish it and someone goes to my website or my web app, the code is downloaded from Wized and run in the user's browser. Because it's run in the user's browser, it is ultimately accessible. So if we stored this API key as a variable It might not happen. Depends on how much traffic, I guess, the site is getting, but it's possible for the API key to be discovered. It's in the code, and we call that an exposed API key or exposed credentials. By creating a secret, it is stored privately and securely by Wized on our own server and is then used in the requests. So it has to get the request from the user's browser, it goes to Wized, Wized enters the API key, and that keeps it secure. So any data that needs to be secret, create a secret for it, keep it nice and safe. Okay, back over to requests and into Groq create story. So we need another header here, and it needs to be, if we go back to documentation, API reference, chat, authorization, bearer, and the API key. Over in Wized, let's add a header. Click into the key where, again, you can enter anything here. Authorization is a frequently used value, and there's often a prefix after the word authorization. There's a list of them here. It's almost always bearer. And then in the value, we need to return our secret. So these aren't in the data store at the minute. We can access these by typing s dot and seeing our API secret key and close that off with a semicolon and close. So we've given it the method, we've given it the URL endpoint where this data will be sent. We've specified the content type and we've said, hey, it's me, here's my API key. The last thing we need to set up is the body. So over on the Groq documentation, everything under D represents the body. Now for the headers, these will be individual items that we create. So we have 2 headers, 1 H for each. For the body, we'll have 2 in there. We'll have 1 for each line. So we're going to have model and we're going to have messages. So let's copy the text for model. This just refers to a particular AI model. There's different AI models that are trained in different ways. They have different settings, and we need to pick which one we're using. So in the request, we'll add an item to the body. Key will be model. The value is going to give us our function editor, and we want to return in quotes to make it a string. Oh, I had quotes already, it turns out. Close it with a semicolon, execute our function. There is our text. Okay. For the next item, messages, we have 2 key value pairs inside here. We have role and we have content. So what we're going to want to do is copy everything in here for messages. Copy. And over in Wized, we are going to add a new item and we are going to call it, was it body? No, it was messages. And then for the value, we want to paste in what we have here. So, mini JavaScript lesson to see what these brackets are. In JavaScript, we have different data types. If we put something inside of quotes, it is going to be a string. So if I execute this, it's inside quotes, and that means that this is a string. It is treated as characters, as text, as words. So I can't, as an example, do math on these. If I use a plus sign, it is going to concatenate or run together the 2 strings. So if I say my name is Rory and return that, it's going to join them together. And programming being very specific, if we don't tell it to put in spaces, it won't put in spaces. If I put in a space there and run it, now we get a space. Next up, we have numbers. So these can either be integers, full numbers, or they can have decimals as well. If we return this, you'll notice that it isn't inside quotes because it's not a string. It's now treated as a number. If we made strings again, 5 plus 5, it is not going to add them. It is going to concatenate them into 55. If we remove the strings, remove the quotes to turn them into integers or ints instead of strings, now they are treated as numbers. Nice and straightforward so far. 2 other data types are arrays and objects. An array is very simply a list. It has square brackets and a number of comma separated items. It could be numbers, which is going to return a nice list. It could be strings, A, B, C, like so. That's an array. Objects are similar to arrays, but they hold key value pairs. So if we go back to our documentation, we have key value pairs here. Role is the key, user is the value, content is the key, this line of text is the value. So we could create something like so we can have something like this. We have an array, a list that has 2 objects inside it for cars. So let's say you have an API that returns a list of cars that are available for rent. It might come back something like this. There's an array that lists all the different values, and then each item that comes back is an object. You're going to see this a lot when working with APIs and API endpoints. So now we can work out what this is. So we're going to copy it and we're going to paste it in here. And what we are passing in is an array that has one object that has 2 key value pairs. It has role is user and the content. In AI tools, the user role is typically the person, the human making the request. And assistant would be the role that we use for the chatbot or the AI tool itself. So role is fine as user. The content, this is called hard coding the value, where we have put it in instead of making it dynamic. So if we run this, that is what we are going to get back. Okay. So we obviously do not want to send the same thing every time. No, we want this to come from our form. So before we pull the data from the form, let's just take a quick look at it inside of Webflow. If you're following along with the clonable, go up to AI Story and into AI Story Generator. So you can either copy this clonable or you can set this up yourself. What you need here to start off is a form. And we're going to have 3 inputs, a text area, a select input, and a number input. So when we build this out, we have a form element here. And in Webflow, the actual form is the second item in. So you have those kind of like lines, and then the next div is the form itself. We need to put a attribute on that. So we looked at attributes in the last video. To keep this organized, all of my elements on this page are going to start off with storygen, short for story generator, an underscore followed by what it is. So I've given this the attribute of storygen underscore form. Then by putting an attribute on the form, we can access all of these fields inside of Wized using the name of the input. So just make sure to give each of these inputs their own name. The text area can be blank. Randomness or temperature is a common parameter in AI tools where you can adjust how random they are. So what we want are a couple of options down here. And for the text, we want to have low randomness, medium randomness, and high randomness because that's obvious to the user. But for the API request, we actually have to send these over as numbers. How do we work that out? We go over to the documentation, and what you'd be doing if a client asked you to implement this is reading down through the documentation to understand what these parameters or options do. So here we have temperature. This either needs to be a number or it needs to be null. Null means empty or not applicable or nothing here in JavaScript. So these are those content types that we just looked at. So remember we discussed strings, numbers or integers, objects, and booleans mean true or false. So the temperature can be a number. It's optional. We don't have to pass this along. And if we don't set it, it defaults to 1. It can be between 0 or 2. Higher values make it more random. Lower values make it more focused and deterministic. So what I've done, you can use any values you like. Low randomness I've set at 0.1, very low. Medium is at the default, is at 1. And high randomness is all the way up at 2. Make it as high as we can go. Why not? Play around. Max tokens. Without getting too technical, tokens are similar to the number of characters that it returns. It's kind of the unit of measure that AI uses for the magic that it does. And we'll enter something like 500, 800 for this value. The higher this is, the more resources it's going to use. So if you're paying for a tool like ChatGPT, more tokens means more money. Okay, so that's our form. The last thing we have for the form is a button, and this is a submit button as part of the form. So we don't need any attributes, Wized attributes on the inputs or the button, just on the overall form. Next up, we have I call these spinners, that icon that you get while the request is loading. And you can make this look however you like. I just have a code embed that has a small amount of CSS and HTML to make this spinner. I have text, generating a story, please wait. And I have both of those wrapped inside a div with a Wized attribute, so I can create logic for this, and Wized cloak. Wized cloak is applied to elements as soon as they are visible on the DOM or in the web page. And we use this for hiding elements immediately. If we don't use this, there can sometimes be a content flash where the element is there and then the logic runs to hide it. So that lets us make it hidden immediately. If you're just joining us and haven't seen the previous video, in the code settings of your website, custom code, you do need to apply some styling to the Wized cloak so that it knows to hide it straight away. So we just have Wized cloak display none. That'll work fine. So those two elements are together in a div that has a Wized attribute and Wized cloak. Similarly, I have a div that holds my title and my text. So the div has a Wized attribute and it has Wized cloak. There's nothing on the title because that doesn't change. The text does have a Wized attribute because we will replace this with the content that comes back from the API call. So I'll go ahead and leave that publishing and switch back over to Wized. So we have set up the app, we have set up our request, and we have our form set up as well. We've nearly finished setting up the request. We need to do one more thing. We need to get these 3 parameters or values into our request. Let's start with the message. We want to click in here. We want to leave role as it is. We want to delete what's there for content. And we can access this either with the dot notation for the request, or we can go up to our data store. In the data store, we have our list of requests. We have Groq generate story. And let's actually run this first. So let's go back to our test content here and exit out of that and run it. So in this panel here, we have the settings for the request, and then we have the log and the response. The response will show us what comes back from the API call or the request. The log will show us how many times it's run on this page and if it was successful or not. Overview will show us if we have any elements or events linked to this. So we can toggle this down to see what comes back from the response. Every API request, every request that we have in Wized will have a result where the request sends back its own data, depending on what the API request is. The state we have for all requests. And this basically tells us, for use in our logic, has it requested? Is it currently requesting? What text did it say to tell us about its status? What status number did we get? So 200 is for success, 500 and 400 are different types of errors, and whether or not it's okay. This would be true or false. Was it successful? So if we run it, we are going to get back a story. And this window is a little tricky for viewing the response in detail. It's more to just give us a quick overview. But I can see in here there's a message that says it looks like you just tested the chatbot by typing test, so on and so forth. So it's working. And what we want to do now is change the test text that we hard coded in. So if we go back over to the request settings and down to body, down to messages, we want to take out this test content. We want to go up to the data store and we want to find F for forms. We'll see our form in here, story gen form. Oh, that's empty. Let me refresh the page. We can also quickly check in the data store. There's our form fields. Okay, they're loading now. So back into the request item, the key is messages. The value, we want to click here into our data store, into forms. There's our story gen form, and we can see the prompt, the randomness, and the max tokens. So let's just go ahead and click prompt. And that is going to add it in. So we can close the data store and we can exit out of here. One limitation is that we can't see the content that is inside here from the function editor. So if we run this, it's not going to put anything in there. That's because the form content is only accessible to us once we submit it. So we can test that. Next, we need to set up the temperature and the token. So again, what you would do is you'd go in here, read the documentation and decide on which parameters you want. So we'll copy temperature, and in Wized, we will add a new item to the body. The key is going to be temperature. And for the value, we want to return, and let's do the dot notation this time, f dot storage and form. You can navigate that list that comes up with your up and down keys. Enter to select it, dot again, randomness. Okay. I'm going to purposefully leave a bug in here so that we can come back and debug it. Okay. Temperature. Next is tokens. So if we go on here and do Command F on Mac or Control F, we can open up our search. And here we have max tokens, integer, optional, max number of tokens that can be generated. Perfect. Let's copy that. And over in Wized, we want to put in max tokens. And we want to return form dot storage and form dot. I'm not sure why my max tokens aren't coming up there. In any case, let's go to the data store, form, max tokens. Okay. Close that, close the function editor, reload the page, put in our story prompt, our randomness slash temperature, come back to it in a minute, and max tokens, we'll say 800. A handy feature when using forms in Wized is that it will take into account if any fields are required or not. So in Webflow, we can see that on the select input, I have set it as required. I think these are all required. Yeah. And the benefit of that is we can take advantage of the built-in validation that it gives us. So let's go for medium randomness, and we haven't linked up generate story yet. So we'll go up here, change over to the second log panel, and we can run this here. This is a useful way of running a request, especially if you haven't linked it to anything yet. So if we run that, it is going to come back with an error. You are going to see a lot of these when working with Wized, especially as you start to move on to bigger projects. It's the nature of coding that you're not going to get the API request correct every time, but we're going to use this as a debugging lesson. So the main thing is stay calm and be patient. Sounds simple, but when you're working on a big project with a deadline, staying calm is important. Read through the error, see can you understand it, search their documentation, take a look in Google, and of course, possibly the quickest option, ask AI. Ask ChatGPT, ask Claude, say, this is the API I'm trying to use. So you can go in here and you can copy that and paste it into ChatGPT, and now it knows how this request works. And you can also paste in the error that you get back and say, help me debug it. We're going to do some good old-fashioned human debugging. So we have the request.data.error.message temperature. Value must be a number. Okay. We know the issue is with temperature and it's expecting a number. So recall we learned about strings and numbers earlier on. Let's go back into the request settings, down to temperature. And because I've run this and submitted the form, I can run this and see what it's coming back with. Okay, it says nothing there. It's saying nothing because we didn't actually submit the form. We just ran it from inside the settings here, which it doesn't pick up as submitting it. So let's pivot here and let's set up our event to actually submit this form. So if we go to X-ray, we can click on the Wized attribute for this element. That's going to open up our settings and our events. We want an event, so add event. There is a event input where we can put in many different types. We're not restricted to just these, but these are the most common ones, and it includes the one we want, which is form submit. Prevent default, we looked at briefly in the last video in the context of a link. For a form, if we don't check this, whatever action we set up here, it's still going to do its default action, which is a Webflow form submission. So this will get sent to Webflow as a form. We mostly, in most cases, don't want that to happen, including this case. So we'll tick that. Reset form means that once it's submitted, it's going to reset all the inputs. I don't want to do that right now. And conditional lets us set different logic for should this be allowed to happen. We don't need that for the time being. So we'll add an action, and that action is going to be perform request. And the request we want to run, we only have one, is Groq create story. And that's all we need for that. So let's close the X-ray and refresh this. And what we can do is we can go into our requests and open this one, go over to the log. And when we run this now, we'll still be able to see the response over here. So we'll click generate story. Oh, wants me to select those. And generate, and we can see, you'll notice that play icon turns into a spinner. Now it's submitting the form and giving us our error. And now if we go back to the request settings and down to temperature, we'll be able to run this and see the value. So here is the issue. It is expecting a number. Technically, we are not sending a number. We are sending a string. So there's a couple of ways in JavaScript we can turn this into a number. The simplest is to do the number function with a capital F inside of brackets. And then we can copy this, we can cut it, and we can paste it inside there. And now when we execute the function, there are no brackets, or sorry, there's no quotation marks around that. It's a number, it's an int, an integer as opposed to a string. Now we can refresh the canvas and we can type in our story, set the temperature, set the tokens. On the right-hand panel, go back over to the log and generate our story. And now we can see, without even looking at all this result info, that it was successful. The status text says success, the status code is 200, and OK is equal to true. And that brings us to the end of part 1 on learning how to set up apps and requests inside of Wized. We have our form set up in Webflow, and we've used Wized to link it to the Groq chat completions API endpoint. In the next video, part 2, we're going to get the returned text displaying on the page, and we're also going to get our spinner or loader animation displaying while the request is in process. If you'd like, you can have a go at this yourself using what we've learned in this video. If you followed along so far, you'll have the form up and running, and you can have a go at linking up the text and getting that loader showing, or feel free to just head straight into part 2 where we'll cover all of that in detail. See you there.